Good morning. It's not a bad turnout on a frosty day like today. My name's Martine Croxall. I'm a presenter with the BBC News Channel ordinarily, but today I have the pleasure of moderating today's debate and of welcoming you to the European Parliament's UK Information Office. Just so that you're aware, I hope you're all meant to be here, this event is going to be streamed live on Facebook Live. Each year, this office co-hosts a debate with the UCL European Institute to coincide with the awarding of the European Parliament's Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought. Named after the Soviet scientist and dissident Andrei Sakharov, the award was created in 1988 to honour people and organisations defending human rights and fundamental freedoms. This year's Sakharov Prize goes to the democratic opposition in Venezuela. There's a large number of people, the National Assembly and all political prisoners as listed by Foro Penal Venezolano. At least 20 of the political prisoners are European. These laureates campaign for freedoms in Venezuela against a backdrop of growing political and social instability. Just also might be worth mentioning that this Sunday, the 10th of December, is Human Rights Day, the day that the United Nations General Assembly adopted in 1948 the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it's a busy weekend for raising awareness. Our discussion, though, is not always linked to the achievements or the field of the Sakharov Prize winners. And this year, the focus is on another very topical issue. Is online privacy a human right? Technology and social media have brought a great number of opportunities for faster, broader, arguably more democratic conversations, communications and civic engagement, but they've also been disruptive in a variety of ways, blurring the boundaries between our public and private lives. They present new challenges to our civil liberties that have yet to be adequately covered by policy or legislation. I thought we'd better define our terms, so of course I went online, and this is what Wikipedia, that font of all knowledge and always reliable, tells us about online privacy. It says it involves the right of personal privacy concerning the storing, repurposing, provision to third parties and displaying of information pertaining to oneself via the internet. So there is, of course, the risk of identity theft when personal data is stolen or sold, but there are many, many other potential threats coming from lots of other quarters. Terrorism, cyberbullying, online stalking that can result in violent crime, governments investing in new surveillance technologies to track our every move and monitor our communications, psychometric voter targeting, such as we saw in the Brexit campaign, when freedom of expression gives way to hate speech, a leak on the scale of the Paradise Papers that expose the workings of offshore finance, morally reprehensible to some, but tax avoidance is not the same as tax evasion. It's questionable how well informed many of us are about how our data is gathered, what it's used for and by whom. The Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg famously expressed his surprise at the willingness of university friends of his to hand over their personal information. And a further complication, different generations seem to have different levels of concern about privacy. According to Steve Rambam, who is an internet private investigator, he says privacy's dead, get over it. So if we want to inhabit the online space and allow governments to keep us safe, do we necessarily have to forego some of that personal privacy? We're joined by three, hopefully soon to be four, guest speakers, whom we'll hear from individually. Then we'll have a group discussion followed by questions from the audience at the end. This office, the European Parliament office in the UK and University College London have sought to create a panel that brings a range of areas of expertise and views, political, legal and academic. Dr. Stephen J. Murdoch is a security researcher at UCL, where he is Royal Society University Research Fellow in the Information Security Research Group of the Department of Computer Science. That's quite a title. He's also a Bi-Fellow of Christ College, Security Architect at the Vasco Innovation Centre in Cambridge, a member of the Advisory Board of the Privacy Enhancing Technologies Symposium and the Programme Committee of the Financial Cryptography and Data Security Conference 2018. We could talk about that for the entire event, I'm sure. John Cooper, QC, is with 25 Bedford Row, visiting professor of law at Cardiff University. He's a master of the bench at Middle Temple. In 2012, was listed in the Times as one of the 100 most influential lawyers in the UK. John advises police forces on data protection, CCTV and privacy, and the IT security company DataSec on protection issues. He also writes regularly for a number of newspapers. Geraldine de Bastian has managed to find us all the way from Berlin. She's a political scientist and co-founder of Connective, a Berlin-based firm specialising in communications and information technology projects in international development. She co-chairs the non-profit organisation, I don't know if that's Digitale or Digitale?
Digitale Gesellschaft.
Digitale Gesellschaft, I knew the Gesellschaft bit, which fights for digital privacy rights and consumer protection. She's also founder of the Global Innovation Gathering, a network of innovators, entrepreneurs, and hacker space managers. We are waiting for Jean Lambert, who's an MEP. She's getting to us, hopefully, from Brussels before we finish. She's been the Green MEP for London since 1999, one of 3 Green MEPs in the UK. She's the party's spokesperson on migration, but she has many other roles, such as being a member of the European Parliament Committee on Civil Liberties, Justice and Home Affairs, and she's vice chair of the Intergroup on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights, but she also works to promote digital rights as well. A representative from the government's Department for Digital Culture, Media and Sport was invited, but they weren't able to provide a speaker this morning because of the timing of the event. If you're using Twitter, please do use the hashtag Sakharov UK. So I'll now ask for your opening statements. Geraldine, let's begin with you.
Okay, thank you so much. Well, first of all, I'd like to say thank you very much for having me here today. It's a big honor to be invited to this event. I'd like to start with a little pre-Christmas story. A friend of mine tweeted the other day, "I have found the worst thing ever." And it was accompanied with a picture of a little security surveillance camera, an elf surveillance camera that reports your children's bad behavior directly to Santa. And and I think it's true. It's probably one of the worst things ever. At least it points a finger, I think, to a lot of issues regarding this topic that we hopefully might address this morning in the debate. I think this is one of many, many examples how we are increasingly living in a world with a lack of trust in human behavior, a lack of trust between institutions, citizens, a lack of trust that is really breeding a culture of surveillance and distrust legitimized by our governments today. And I think whilst this is a problem on a personal level, it is definitely a problem on a political and institutional level, in particular in a time of rising populist tendencies across Europe, where we really need more trust in our political institutions. But then how are we to trust them? How are we to build trust in them if our governments are treating us as citizens as if we're all general suspects? In the last couple of days, there's been a lot of uproar in Germany about the introduction of the Chinese credit score system, social credit score system, and the sort of, now the dark future of surveillance is finally here. But I'd like to argue that we're sort of on the pretty much same path in our Western societies as well. We might just not be making such a public issue out of it. Just to name 2 examples, predictive policing is already a thing that is not a future scenario anymore, but very much happening in Germany today, as is AI-determined insurance policy selection without any form of public control or even substantial public debate on how we should be controlling these technologies in future. So all this is happening whilst at the same time there shouldn't really be any differentiation between online and offline privacy. The United Nations Human Rights Council has enshrined privacy as a fundamental human right. So the very simple answer to the topic of today's debate would be yes. Yes, absolutely. Whether privacy is an online or offline issue, there is an absolute fundamental right towards it. And as you already said in your introduction, the problem is that legislation with the fast evolving technologies has been slow to catch up to that. And in the meantime, both private sector entities and governments have set up systems of complete data tracking and surveillance and therefore control. There's some hope, maybe, in Germany at least. I'd be interested to hear how it's here in the UK. There's a lot of debate at the moment to see how the EU Privacy Directive is going to be implemented. There's maybe a little bit of a lack of debate in the private sector that I think is trying to ignore this directive in some ways. But by spring next year, we're going to have to face what that might mean for companies, what it might mean for international platforms and for citizens. From a civil rights point of view, there are a lot of positive things in this directive, including giving back data control to individuals, forbidding, for instance, the selling of your data to third parties, as is already true for telecommunications companies, but broadening this to digital platforms, social media platforms, etc. Really, and not just on a non-functioning self-implementation, but on an actual directive level, installing no track, do not track, and privacy by design regulations. So not putting the whole responsibility onto the individual or the citizen, but really taking the responsibility back, putting it into the suppliers of the technology's hands. And last but not least, the right to encrypt, which is continuously under attack here in the UK by politicians, but the importance of encryption and the right to anonymity is one of the key factors of how to regain a little bit of power and control. So yeah, very much looking forward to debating these points with everybody on the panel.
So much to discuss, isn't there? It's hard to keep control of it. Stephen, would you like to share your thoughts for a couple of minutes?
Thank you. So, as Geraldine said, in some ways the topic of the debate is a strange question. So, is online privacy a human right? Well, privacy is a human right, so why should online be treated any differently than people using the phone or using a car to visit a friend? But I think online is different, and that's because of the technology involved. And the technology does have consequences. So I'm going to mention two of these. So one is that computers are really good at automating repetitive tasks. That's why we use computers. It's one of their strengths, but it's also one of their weaknesses. And the second one is not so much technical, but economic, which is that the internet is now essentially funded through advertising. Google is funded by advertising to about 90%, Facebook is more, and it's companies like that who are designing the structure of the internet, and they are designing it to support the needs of the advertisers, not the individual citizens. And what advertisers need is the centralized collection of large amounts of data on what you read, how long do you read it for, what do you say, who are you talking to, what do you buy. All this information is being collected, and the internet is structured to make it easy to collect this information and then automatically process this for the advertiser's need. But this has consequences for privacy. So this data can be collected for advertising, but it can just as well be used for surveillance. And because of the automated nature of this type of surveillance, it's not targeted at a few people where there's already reason to believe they're suspicious. It's targeting everyone. And it's not applied with human discretion and understanding of context. The automated systems which are performing these sorts of processing doesn't understand that. And people are starting to realize, and people are starting to react. So in the aftermath of the Snowden disclosures, that there was wide-scale internet surveillance by the NSA and information sharing with many other governments, people have observed a statistically significant drop in the number of people reading Wikipedia articles discussing controversial topics. And that's because people who are potentially considering reading these articles do not trust that the surveillance rules will be applied with sufficient discretion and sufficient understanding of context. So essentially, they're being afraid to read. And this brings me on to one of the fundamental human rights that's mentioned in the same section of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as the freedom of expression, which is the freedom to make and hold opinions. And if someone is unable to read because they're too afraid to read, then can they really be said to have the ability to exercise their right to form and to hold their opinions. So the governments often say that what should be illegal offline should be illegal online. And the ways that this is now being implemented is laws that were designed for offline use are being applied online. But because of the nature of centralization, because of advertisers, and because of the nature of automated processing, the discretion of implementation and the understanding of context that was imagined when the rules were being drafted are not actually the ones that are going to be implemented. So I think online is different, and that if there are changes necessary, which I think there probably are, what I don't think they should be going in the direction of is increasing surveillance. I think they should go in the direction of how do we protect our online privacy and other human rights in the context of technology which does not have consequences that we would want in order to actually protect those rights.
Stephen, thank you. Should we have a legal perspective from John? Well, good morning, Jean. Good morning. Thank you for getting here.
Thank you. I think it's right to recognise immediately that as far as the attack on privacy is concerned, we're looking at the attack from a legal and indeed from a human perspective from two sources, the state and corporate entities. Those are the two prongs of the attack against us the citizen. In terms of the legal approach to this, it's also startling perhaps to remind ourselves, and I'll use the criminal law as an analogy, that every single act of Parliament that we use in the criminal law, for instance, to regulate or to control or attempt to control criminality online are acts of Parliament that were passed before Twitter and Facebook were even invented. And so that, if you use the criminal problem as an analogy here, it's the same problem that can be transcribed into what we're discussing today. The fact is the law is trying to catch up and keep up with usefully monitoring, controlling, regulating, and in the terms of criminal activity, criminally controlling activity online. But that's not to say that the law shouldn't be able to grapple with it, but there needs to be proportionality, and that I think is a word that I'd like to introduce right at the very start of our discussions here. Everything that's done needs to be proportionate. And in terms of an analysis particularly of security use and security breaches, as I would say, of privacy and online activity, the response has not been proportionate. Max Hill, for instance, the very able new appointment as far as the independent reviewer of terrorism is concerned, has himself said very sensibly, we should stop knee-jerking into laws, controls and provisions which enable, for instance, privacy to be breached. And a lot of the controls which are breaching privacy, in my view, or threaten to breach privacy, certainly when one considers, and I'll move on to the corporate aspect in a moment, certainly when one considers security issues, has fundamentally been knee-jerk. And in fact, if you look at a number of the atrocities that have been committed, either recently in the last year, or indeed in few years before that, it's generally accepted that none of the security measures that are imposed now that breach privacy, in my view, would have stopped those atrocities happening. And so I think it's very important indeed when one, and no doubt it will come in the debate, quite properly so, in my view, people will be of the view, sensibly, well, we need to protect ourselves. We need to control and protect inappropriate activity, particularly when it comes to national security. Well, yes, but it has to be effective. And what we have at the moment is all take and no give. We have the taking of our privacy, but in terms of our privacy being taken away from us, we're not getting much back in return. And when we hear of the tremendous work our security services are doing, one only reads in the newspapers this week of a high number of appalling threats to individuals in the country being thwarted by our security services, it would be interesting to know, and I don't have the statistics, how many of those successful operations that have thwarted terrorist activity are as a result of any of the breaches of privacy that we have to endure. So it's proportionality that needs to be taken into account, in my view, when one considers the right, the basic human right. And as has just been said a moment ago by one of my fellow panellists, we already have, in fact, a human right to protect our privacy. It comes particularly under Article 8 of the European Convention on Human Rights. It's not a very good protection, I have to say, for anyone that knows Article 8, and it's not even an absolute right. It's a restricted right, if I can put it that way. And it is always mollified, for instance, by a list of reasons, including national security and including the solving of crime. So that's probably where, if we are debating privacy online, where privacy online will fit in within the Article 8 category of a restricted human right. Can I briefly also just touch upon commercial and corporate attacks upon our privacy? There's a very important change of the law about to happen, the General Data Protection Regulation. We'll talk about it more. It's been touched upon again a moment ago. This is one of the most important pieces of legislation, of regulation that's been passed or will be passed for a long, long time. It comes into force on the 25th of May next year, and it gives us, the citizen, far more rights over how our data is used. And I'll just conclude with this, because it's one of the points I think you were interested in as well, in discussing. For all that's going on, for all the invasions of our privacy, for all the attacks on our privacy, and they are there, and they are significant, how much do people really know about what's going on? How aware are our fellow citizens of the attacks that are going on? Well, I'll leave you with one fact, and we can develop it later. When the legislation, the so-called Snoopers Charter, was passing through Parliament, very few MPs turned up to debate it. Very few people in Parliament challenged it. It was smokescreen through on the back of the Brexit debates, and most of the public don't even know it has happened. When one looks at the statistics, European statistics, of the general awareness of people in this country about how their data is being used, we are one of the most unaware countries in Europe. And by the way, it gets to a thing, doesn't it, when the Snoopers Charter is being used by China as an example of good practice.
Oh, thank you very much. Jean, over to you for a couple of minutes.
Okay, well, having heard my fellow panellists, I'm not sure what I'm going to add to this, but I mean, yes, there is a very clear human right dimension to this, both in the European Convention, as others have mentioned, and in the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, where at the moment we have a discussion going on about how far that is going to be included in the withdrawal bill in Parliament here. So, and the EU Charter sort of slightly updated the convention, talking not about correspondence and privacy in correspondence, but privacy in communication. And so this has been quite a sort of strong line, I think, in everything that we've tried to do at the European Parliament level on this, where a number of the tensions that we've just been hearing are certainly there within the political decision making. But I think for many of us, we take the view that if we're looking at increasingly, as some would say, that we have a battle for values going on at the moment, then it's really important that we try and uphold those fundamental principles, those fundamental rights, and that applies as much online as it does in any other way. And that certainly in some of the debates that we've had in Parliament, European Parliament, where we've been talking about these issues, you know, the lines have been used about, well, you know, how far would you want somebody following you down the street, walking with you into every shop or restaurant that you might go into, asking you, well, you know, what do you think? Would you like to just write it down in my sort of autograph book or whatever? And that, you know, if you don't want that happening to you in your personal life, you know, real physical life, as it were, why should you be prepared to put up with that from the various devices and so on that you hold, and where you're not clear necessarily where that data then goes on to, who uses it, who has access? And so a number of those questions have been very important to us in the Parliament, not least in terms even of international relations. And, you know, so that is maybe something we can pick up in the discussion later. But it has, the arguments are very much around, do you do maximum sort of collection of data, maximum data crunching, or do you, particularly in the criminal field, look at what is proportionate, targeted, effective, those principles being there, and that in the data protection regulation discussions, a lot of that has been around, you know, what right do companies have to automatically use your data? How can you prevent that being traced back to you as an individual? And that shouldn't you also then have the same rights in terms of your communications that you have? And that also should be private. Encryption, yes, has been a lively discussion. I'm sure we'll come back to that. But much of it is about how do we protect those fundamental values, and where are the boundaries on that? The boundaries that are absolute to you as a citizen, as compared to what is needed for the proper sort of security of society in general, rather than maybe the state, which might be a rather different thing.
Jean, thank you very much. Well done, having just arrived. Barely caught your breath. Stephen, can you quantify at all just how much we are being tracked and by whom?
So I think it's hard to say because the companies that are doing this are private companies and they don't want to talk about exactly how much they're collecting. For the companies that are driven by advertising, so the likes of Google and Facebook, I think they will collect everything that they legally can collect, which is almost everything. Other companies maybe are going to be a bit more privacy protecting when they're not so much driven by advertising. So I think here Apple was interesting that they actually had in one of their keynote talks, at 3 different points they talked about how their system was privacy protecting, trying to differentiate themselves from the competition. But I think essentially anything you do online, and certainly anything that involves adverts, will probably be collected.
It's easy, Geraldine, to talk about privacy as if it's a wholly good thing, but it has downsides surely too, doesn't it? That it can be exploited to cover toxic and even criminal activity.
I don't think this sort of either-or perspective is something that I'd agree to. I think privacy, as said in the beginning statement, is a fundamental right and therefore a positive thing. Can I add one point to the previous, just quickly? I think one of the issues that is important to recognise is the increasing merger between on and offline, and that there is no more complete differentiation of what we do and our behavioural patterns that are being tracked online and what we're doing offline, and the issue of how we're being tracked, for instance, when we use the airport wireless or in a shopping mall, and the sort of patterns of movement. I mean, years and years ago, I think England is so much more advanced in this, in quotation marks, than Germany is. I saw an advert in the subway saying, now you can use your Barclays debit Visa as your Oyster card, and this is like a long time ago already, and way back then I was already like, oh my goodness, what a terrible thing. Why would you invite just that complete sort of transparency of movement? And that's something I think that a lot of people aren't aware of at the moment, that the exact same patterns that you just described for online tracking are also increasingly true offline. Of course, it's important to talk about digital security as well, and it's important to talk about rights on different levels. But like I said, I don't think I would. I try not to buy into the either-or between privacy and anonymity and security on the other side.
John mentioned the Snoopers Charter, or to give it its correct title, the Investigative Powers Act of 2016. The Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, hailed it as world-leading legislation that provided unprecedented transparency and substantial privacy protection. I don't know whether you regard Edward Snowden as your hero or anti-hero, but he said that the act was the most extreme surveillance in the history of Western democracy. Jean, if you've got nothing to hide, you should have nothing to fear, we're told. What's the problem with that argument?
Yes, it's an argument very frequently used. And I think that it assumes that nothing you do comes into question, in a sense that you consider that what you're doing is perfectly fine, and therefore everybody else should consider that, surely. And then you suddenly discover that there are points where actually what you're doing isn't necessarily considered as fine by other people. You know, we've seen this recently in some of the discussions about, for example, accessing online pornography, which is not illegal, but, you know, suddenly a lot of other people don't think this is fine. And so it's this question about, I don't know, this feeling that therefore everything about you should be available to the state, that the state owes you nothing in terms of safeguarding, it owes you nothing in terms of transparency and accountability, it owes you nothing in terms of you being able to change information that it might hold about you which is inaccurate and which affects you. We've seen this, for example, within some of the Schengen database systems in the past, years back, you know, with people trying to fly from Stansted Airport to Genoa to, you know, protest there at the G7 or G20. I'm losing my G's here. But, you know, and suddenly being told they can't fly. Well, why can't you fly? Oh, because it says here you can't fly. And never being able to unpick why it is that suddenly your freedom of movement has been restricted because of information that somebody holds about you, when you have never actually been convicted of anything. You know? So I think this assumption, it may make us feel sort of warm and cuddly, but I don't think we should ever assume that, you know, we're never suspect.
It's an interesting expression you just used, Jean, about when you've never been convicted of anything. There's a very small issue as well, which is a very defined issue about the retention of data. I'll give you an example. Innocent people that go to a police station, that are interviewed, are considered to be potential suspects, and then critically, no charges brought, and hold the front page. That means they're innocent in the eyes of the law. Any photographs or images taken of them can be retained. Fingerprints can be destroyed, DNA can be destroyed, but still, as far as the law is concerned, any image taken of a person, however innocent, is retained and kept upon databases. And there's a campaign, particularly, I'm involved with an organisation called Big Brother Watch, and there's a campaign where we're involved with at the moment, trying to bring that more to public attention. So it is innocent until proven guilty, and put to one side those that may have convictions and may well be on the radar and may well need to be monitored. We're not being silly about it. A lot of innocent people, all of us, maybe, could well be having data retention, privacy breaches against ourselves.
But John, I wonder how many people are really that worried about this, because last year there was a survey that found that nearly 50% of British people agreed with the idea of increasing the security services' powers, and by June this year that had increased even further. So you talk about the need for surveillance, but that's highly subjective, isn't it? And you are in the same breath asking our governments to keep us safe.
Well, it's a bit like motherhood and apple pie, isn't it? If you put a question in a certain way to people, I'd like to see what question they were asked. You know,
the facts.
Do you want more laws to make you safe? Yes, please. We'd all, I think, say yes. But then if you said, well, this is the law we're proposing, which effectively doesn't work all the time and has had a minor impact upon finding terrorists or stopping terrorist offences. A lot of other things have had bigger impacts. Next question, do you still want this law which takes away your privacy and your basic rights? And you may have a different answer. I suspect people are being asked a very bland question. Do you want a law which protects you? And that's motherhood and apple pie, of course we do.
Let's talk about, for a moment, the idea of voting and how voting can be affected by the use of data. We understand that there was interference, some would call it, in the EU referendum here last year. If it's open season, Jean, and all parties can engage in it, why is there a problem? It's a level playing field, isn't it?
Well, it's a playing field determined quite often by the amount of money that you have. Also by how willing you are to, how far you're willing to push your boundaries as to what you think is sort of decent and honourable and engages people in a democratic process. as opposed to what do you think is manipulation of the debate in a way which cannot be responded to and which is, you know, not fully covered by our national regulation. I mean, you can't do foreign funding of campaigns in England, Scotland and Wales, you know, and yet it seems fine that you can use, you know, sort of foreign support in other ways. So I think it's not about a level playing field. I think it is a very deep concern, because it's also of concern back to the issue of where does the information come from in the first place that is being used. If you want to raise questions about it, how easy is it to do that? Because this is cross-border quite often. You know, so therefore, where's the international dimension of this? Let alone about whether, you know, it may be legal, but is it ethical?
It just leads me on then to the extent to which companies, Stephen, you've talked about how much information that they can gather and they can do so legally. As consumers then, what should we be looking out for? How can we protect ourselves from the worst of it if we want to try and limit the invasion?
Yeah, I think it's challenging at best and possibly impossible for individuals to actually do anything about this by themselves, because individuals' interests are so diverse and so dispersed that they don't have any way to actually argue against the very concentrated and organised market of advertisers who are against this. So I think it's almost certainly going to be governments that are going to be stepping in, and realistically it's going to be the EU which is going to take this approach, because the approach in America is more try to let the market decide, and I think there is a market failure here, and I think steps like the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, and the Privacy Directive is probably going to be the right approach. It all depends on how it's going to be implemented. So one of the key things that the GDPR gives is the requirement that companies obtain consent from people. But is that actually going to be meaningful? It says it has to be meaningful, it has to be informed, it has to be freely given. But is this going to be an option that you've got to choose this box and give up all your data? Or your alternative is you're no longer able to use Facebook and suddenly you've cut out a vast proportion of the population. I don't think that's freely given in any meaningful sense, but will Facebook be allowed to get away with that?
How much worse is it going to get with the Internet of Things, where we have all these appliances that are connected to the internet, constantly feeding our data back, you know, what we've put in our fridge and how often we've used the washing machine. How much worse is it going to be for us as consumers?
Well, I tried to sort of point at that by saying, you know, the merger of the online and the offline. I think we had a debate on this at the German Ministry of Justice, and I found it quite symbolic of the general debate in Germany that a representative of the Association of German Tech and Internet Companies in one sentence basically said the people who are going to be using these IoT home devices, but particular are going to be and benefiting from these are in particular are elderly people and perhaps people also with some kind of physical special needs, and sort of went on about all the wonderful opportunities that this brings. And in the same sentence says, but you know, it's going to be up to the users to really make sure that these devices are safe and to perhaps download some patches and make sure they don't create a huge hazard for these individuals as well as for the broader network of internet users, which is absurd, right? It's absurd to look at that kind of demography and target group to say, dear 85-year-old lady living at home, here's your smart toaster and it's up to you to download the patch and make sure it's safe. So finding a balance between, of course, wanting innovation from the private sector, but on the other hand, also giving consumers security and safety about the devices that they're letting into their own home that they're going to use is really important. And security updates are a really, really important issue in this. We can't be creating and selling devices. This is true for every mobile phone as well, where we sort of inbuilt that after a year or two of buying what is an expensive device, you cannot update your operating system anymore and therefore create a security hazard. So I think that between sort of what, of course, is the sort of want from the private sector, which is to leave this as open as possible and rely on yes, self-organization. We do need some harder regulation on these issues.
The problem is with all this, I totally agree. The problem is with all this, of course, is let's be realistic about it. The state want a breach our privacy. The state want the information. Corporate entities want to breach our privacy. They want this information. So no one's necessarily going to help the citizen. Where normally we seek to rely on government and parliament, for instance, or alternatively other bodies, regulatory bodies, when it comes to business, to protect interests, it's not in their interests, be it for so-called security purposes or just getting our information, to actually help us. Let's remind ourselves, for instance, that a lot of the material, and we're clawing it back a little now through recent court cases, but when the Snoopers Charter first came out, a number of ministries were using it to obtain information, from the Food Ministry to Department of Work and Pensions. A whole range of government ministries were using the Snoopers Charter to begin with to get our information. That was great for them. So it's a matter of who is going to protect us. And added to that, linking into what you've just been saying, if the citizen, if the people aren't that bothered, how can you get a momentum for them to be protected? It comes to, in my view, the fundamental basic thing we need to do is it's education, education, education. When you're asked if you want to have a loyalty card at Tesco's or any other organisation, say no.
And all the points you can get, all the air miles you can
Well,
get.
you know, it's give and take, isn't it? You know, okay, I mean, all right, say no on the basis of your information about what it really means to have a loyalty card. Now, at the moment, all it means is your air miles, and all it means is getting some money off a purchase, say. But if we were better, it's our fault. If we were better at putting it out there, as an actual fact, you're also selling your data, you're also giving away your personal stuff. It might just stop people thinking about
But
these
some people
issues.
don't mind, do they?
Yeah, I think it's, you know, it's such a key, informed decision making. As long as I know what I'm getting myself in for, we talked about this earlier just briefly. I witnessed a debate between a father and a son recently, and the son was saying, but I want this. I would pay Google to give me a targeted advertisement if it wasn't doing that already. And it was a very passionate debate, and maybe there is you know, some room for that somewhere, but at least if there's a informed decision-making and an agency. And I think what bothers me a lot about debates that we have in Germany around this is the sort of air of, and this is perpetuated by both the private sector and by politicians increasingly, the air of lack of power and any sort of lack of agency to change the status quo as it is, and just sort of run with this wild, blind data collection chase, right? And of course, there is a lot of space that the data can do a lot of great things. I think the UK is so much more advanced than Germany when it comes to good examples of open data in the public sector and how effective that can be. And also effective can be in future when we create, you know, smart city environments that actually serve the people rather than just the institutions creating the technology behind them.
Yeah, just could I add to that? I'd be very careful with views that we should push more responsibility onto the individuals or push more responsibility for through education indirectly, because the people who are in the least position to actually do something about it are also most likely the most vulnerable people. So yeah, loyalty cards are annoying, they do invade your privacy, but they give money back to people, and the people who actually had difficulty affording food are the people who are going to be in the least position to actually give up this loyalty card. So that's why I'm slightly more positive for wide-ranging protections that apply equally to everyone, rather than just saying in order to protect your privacy, you've got to give up something of value, because not everyone has that much to give up.
I have to say, I disagree with that. I know you're using this as an example, for instance, that because people can't pay for food, they should therefore be able to give up their privacy so they can pay for food. I don't buy
think
into
that's
that.
quite what Stephen's saying, is it?
I think it's a mix of regulation and having settings that do enable privacy by design or privacy by default, so that it's not your individual responsibility to read through a text like this that you don't understand to then say, I'm not sure if I want this actually, plus the informed, educated citizen. And I know that censorship isn't our topic here today, but it kind of struck me as you were speaking earlier, how different some of these things are, and sort of just political climate is for. censorship issues in particular between England and Germany. When I arrived at the airport today, I tried to, I'm outing myself here, I tried to find a YouTube video about a trashy robot contest in Japan, and it was blocked. And I had to sit there for 5 minutes and wondering why. Was it because it contained the word trashy in the title? And then I sat there thinking, and I think it's because one of the trashy robots, and there's children present at this contest watching them. It's a very funny video. I recommend it if you can unblock it in this happy country of yours. I think it uses a sex toy that is built into one of these robots. And that's the best reason I could think of was why this very, very cheerful, happy 8-minute video was not available on YouTube here. And this sort of, I know it's a silly example, but the kind of question of, do you want to have informed citizens that are able to, do their own internet settings and protect their children, but also choose what they want to see online, or do you want to have all these preset regulations? And I think that sort of ties into that.
Yeah, but I think there's the part of it where certainly, what we've been trying to do with the legislation at the European level is to have at least some sort of, to build in safeguards if you can. But it's not everything. It's like most things, the law is good, but it's not everything. You need also the engagement and the ability also to make the law work, to enforce it. But that issue about education and information, I think, is also really crucial to this. And that a lot of the time we get caught up with, it's the keeping up with the latest developments or whatever it is, but where is the space sort of within our education systems or elsewhere to actually discuss the implications of this, so that people, who are going to be the decision makers in future also, have an understanding of what it is. And we're seeing this, I mean, you were talking about reasons why that particular video may be blocked. But one of the areas as well where it's a debate in the Parliament coming up on the implementation of legislation around child pornography in the internet. I mean, basically it's child abuse, not child pornography. But this has been one of the discussions there as well about at what point do you set the limits. And the UK there, again, slightly different attitude to Germany in terms of, do you block, do you take down sites, whatever. And, how do you also get people aware of, that whatever you post, you've got to assume it is never private.
Absolutely.
This whole sort of understanding about how you live with new technology.
And how far things travel and how quickly as well. In October, the European Parliament Civil Liberties Committee adopted proposals to reinforce our right to use encrypted services and allow internet users to access a website, even if you refuse to accept cookies, which I do as often as possible. Just irritates me, never mind anything else. The legislation would not only apply to the content of communications, but also the so-called metadata, which tells those looking at it, the location that we're in, the timing of it, the duration and the type of communication. How much of a leap forward, Jean, is this?
Well, we from the Parliament think that this is really important. It was quite controversial. I mean, you certainly saw a political divide in it. There's all that sort of background to it. But yeah, we think it's really important. Whether we actually manage, what it will be like at the end of the day by the time we finish discussing and debating this will be another issue. But, we've certainly felt that within that we made a lot of advances there. But holding on to them is going to be very tough when it comes to discussing this with national governments.
And there'll also be a commercial kickback against it, won't there?
Well, this has been part of the discussion and the political interests within it. About sort of, but companies these days need to, exactly as was being said, more of their income, comes from online advertising. Therefore, if you try and restrict that, you try and restrict their access to the information they have about potential customers. Isn't this going to sort of hold back business here? And then there are others who will make the argument, but actually, the more people have to sort of consciously accept or enter into a relationship with a particular company, for the company, you can argue that that's actually better. They've got people who haven't just had to click a button to be able to read whatever it is they want to read or, whatever. This is people that may actually be interested in your product. So, you know, that was also part of the background to it. But we think that what we've put on the table there is really important.
You talked at the beginning, Geraldine, about this issue of trust. To what extent could that be used to galvanise companies and governments, for that matter? Companies probably more so, who are worried about sort of reputational damage, that invading our privacy is bad for business.
Well, I personally am hoping for a kind of an uprise of business models that embrace privacy and encryption and data protection. I work a lot in development cooperation, and it's something that, you know, when Germany and German development organizations think about, well, what's our selling point? You know, we're not the home of Apple, Facebook, and co. So what do we go and sell in the world when it comes to digital innovation? Privacy and data protection is one of the key issues because of the strong legislation we've had on a national level in the past. And post-Snowden, there was a lot of debate in the German private sector and the German startup economy saying this is our opportunity to really emphasize creating new innovative tools and business models on the basis of strong data protection and encryption. And I still have a hope that that's going to happen.
We can never get away from Brexit for very long, can we? So here it is. When the UK withdraws from the EU, how important do you think it's going to be for, and here's that phrase of the week, regulatory alignment, going to be for the UK with the EU with regard to sort of data protection issues and legislation regarding privacy?
Yeah, well, I think the general data protection regulation here is the key bit of legislation, and I think it's still not entirely clear how this will actually continue post-Brexit. There is a UK implementation of it, the Data Protection Bill, which is currently being discussed in government and in Parliament. This is mostly a copy and paste of the GDPR, but there's always some little UK-based quirks that have been introduced. So, for example, there's far less privacy protection in the UK implementation when it involves immigration and enforcement versus the original EU one, so that's not too surprising. But then there's also the question of in order for a British company to operate in the EU, processing data of EU citizens, then they've got to comply with the EU law, whether they like it or not. It's just that Britain will no longer be able to influence EU law, but they will still be beholden by a lot of it, particularly around data protection. So that's probably not so good for Britain. Maybe it could be better for privacy, because often the government within the EU, which has been pushing for fewer privacy protections, has been Britain, and now they won't have that voice anymore.
How effective at the moment is international cooperation with regard to these different laws? I mean, beyond the EU as well, because obviously it's a massive issue around the world.
I mean, international cooperation is vital, particularly when it comes to considering corporate aspects of privacy. And also perhaps creating a norm, an international norm, as far as privacy and corporate engagement is concerned. Let me use a rather strange analogy of the International Maritime Organization, I think it's called. They control or create norms for all people that trade on the high seas, on the international seas. And so if you transcribe the international seas for online, I think the principle maintains. So a body creating international norms of behaviour would help, not necessarily regulations or laws, but norms would be a step forward. It can only go so far, though, particularly when it comes to corporate engagement, because fundamentally people are out there, and this is not a criticism, to make profit, of course, and that's the way the world turns. So there can only be perhaps a degree of cooperation, and there has to be, and there's the key word, trust. But norms, international norms may help.
But what about sanctions that you impose? Who imposes them? What nature of would the sanctions be?
Well, that has to come down to in terms of not only domestic legislation, but legislation within European tribunals as well. And that, for instance, is where we have new regulations coming through on 25th of May as far as data protection is concerned, whereby we'll be keen to see how they're enforced and what sanctions there are. But the implicit underlie of your question, I think, is a good one. That is, you've got to have teeth. Something's got to have teeth ultimately at the end of it all. And we see time and time again, don't we, that there's a lot of people in other areas of the law saying that things are wrong. Press complaints, for instance, is an example. Well, they're wrong, but what's the sanction? And there has to be a sanction. And at the moment, it's not clear to me where the sanction lies, and that has to be, or what the sanction will be. And indeed, the sanction has to be significant if we're dealing with corporate entities. But I think it's a step-by-step thing, to be quite frank with you. First, let's try and create, the question is internationally, international norms, at least to create a standard. And then, of course, in due course, the sanction.
Moderators always like it when a panellist compliments the question. I would like to ask you for your questions now, if that's possible. If you have a question you'd like to ask, please put your hand up, tell us who you are, if there's an organisation you particularly represent today, and who, if anyone on the panel, your question is aimed at. Let us start here and we'll work across. Let me try and remember who's put their hands up. Okay, thank you. We start in the corner with two. Have we got microphones? Yeah, thank you. We've got a microphone for you, so you don't have to strain your voice.
I was just going to ask about online privacy with regards to people's names being used on social media. For example, if people make an adverse comment about someone, and then can people then take that out of context and then use it in other circumstances to try and create value against them under other circumstances, or is it possible to actually start thinking about how people might be told that maybe they can't actually comment on other people on the social media, or is that a freedom of expression where your freedom of expression and your online privacy come into conflict because there's no actual bar on people using your name in any comment they wish to make on social media, is there?
And they can appropriate it for use later on as well, you mean?
Or even by commercial organisations for other purposes, or even for legal purposes on legal cases and so on. They could use it for all sorts of purposes.
Wow, what a
where
minefield.
you might not have the right to challenge it, or where you might not even be aware that they've made that comment.
Yeah, and of course, linked into that is something we need to discuss as well, the so-called right to be forgotten as well, which is a big issue on the social media, and there is such a right, by the way. We can talk about that later. But answering your question directly, the social media, I often advise my clients in this way when it comes to crime. I was involved with something called the Twitter joke trial. Some of you may have come across, representing a guy called Paul Chambers. And it got me involved with a lot of discussions about behaviour on the social media. And the first thing to say is a very practical piece of advice. There's very little control you presently can have. You maybe have copyright stuff in certain extreme circumstances, but that's just quite frankly impracticable as far as the social media is concerned. There's very little control you have once it's out there. Obviously, if the remark is defamatory or indeed breaches potentially the Communications Act or the Malicious Communications Act or the Public Order Act, I could go on and on, or the Anti-Harassment Act, that's different. But in the general principle, if you put something out there, you will lose control over it. And so the thing that I always say to clients of mine is, and I was discussing it before we came on, if you wouldn't say it face to face, don't say it with your index finger.
What about the right to be forgotten? Does it smack of censorship to you?
No, I think those are two very different things. Your individual right to this is again like to your data online, to your profile online. There's a great case of Max, the guy from Vienna who tried to sue Facebook and have all his data being handed out, which is, I think a great example for, how far are you not in control of your own data once you've agreed to the terms and services of such a platform.
How do you limit that then, Stephen, on social media? I mean, surely, in some ways, I'm not suggesting that cyberbullying is acceptable at all, but if you put yourself out there, you have to accept the risks, don't you?
Well, I think companies who are dealing with social media are going to have to answer some questions here, because one of the things in the GDPR is that not only can you give your consent for your data to be processed, you also have the right to take that consent away. And then the company has to somehow deal with removing your information. And because information often gets so much entangled with other people's information, it could actually be challenging for them to do this.
There's another question there. In the corner. We'll work our way across, try and get to everybody.
Hi.
It's on, it's working, yeah.
Okay. Hi, I'm just a student, so apologise my naivete from LSE. So I've read widely on this, and I think my opinion is that law on its own is not enough to tackle this because of the peculiarities of how algorithms work and how ingrained they are in our lives. So I was thinking if any one of you could give an idea about a technical solution to this, like recalling the idea of how code can itself be law. So could that happen, and is the GDPR enough if I still don't know how Facebook judges me and how it judges my behavior and affects my behavior after that? Yeah.
I love it when people quote Lessig. Do you want to?
Okay, I can say briefly. Well, I think we probably touched on this. So encryption is one of the tools that we can use in order to protect our privacy. That protects what you're saying, but not who you're talking to or what you're reading or things like that. For protecting that, you do need additional technologies that actually hide who you're communicating with. So privacy-enhancing technologies or anonymous communication technologies. There, we'd like the law kind of to stay out of the way. But I think, yeah, it's hard for either of these either law or code to exist in their own. Companies will not allow you to implement these unless they're legally compelled to, and that's why our law comes in.
My name's Harriet Dean. I work for the Home Affairs Committee in the House of Commons. I just wonder what the speakers thought of the response that you sometimes hear in relation to security, that the increased surveillance is a way of levelling the playing field. In the 1950s, if you were known to be plotting a terrorist attack, security services could intercept your mail and they could listen to your phone line and have oversight of your communications in that way. Whereas now, even if you're known to be planning a terrorist attack, they cannot read the WhatsApp messages you're sending. What are your views on that in terms of encryption, providing opportunities for people that weren't previously available?
Yeah, I mean, I don't get it across that I'm against measures being used in a proportionate and proper way with sufficient and proper reason, to use one of the expressions I think Dominic Grieve used recently, as far as steps are concerned to prevent terrorist attacks. It's the uncoordinated general invasion of privacy that concerns me, the unstructured, knee-jerk gathering in of metadata, bulk data, what you will, and simply storing it for no real apparent reason, with very little control over it. Yes, there's now going to be a degree of judicial intervention involved. We've finally got that, but very little control or oversight over it. There's absolutely nothing wrong at all with targeted surveillance, though, and I think that legislation and the law should provide for that. So I don't think I'm actually disagreeing with the basis of your question. The targeted surveillance, for good and sufficient reason, is absolutely an important tool as far as the security services are concerned. But what's happening here is it's far more of a generalised power that the Snoopers Charter is handing down. And when it comes to general surveillance of the UK in particular, as a person for camera, we are the most photographed and surveyed country in the world, and that includes North Korea and China. So we need proportionality. That's the point.
Can I just add sorry, is
No,
that okay?
yes, I just have to say, the BBC journalist in me has to say, Investigatory Powers Act.
Yeah, yes, indeed.
I would just
yes.
like to absolutely agree with everything that's just been said. And in mainland Europe, in Germany and France, and in particular also this applies to the, and of course, it sounds like a sixth sentence to say we've been lucky and have had only one terrorist attack of that kind of nature in my hometown, Berlin, but definitely applies to that example that, and like I said, to a number of other, basically all the main news examples of attempted terror attacks, all those that actually took place in France and in Germany, that targeted surveillance would have been the key, and most of these people were known as suspects to the police. There were mistakes made in the investigations. People could have been stopped if there were more capacity on the side of the police to actually follow up on the leads that they've gotten, and this is one of the key issues. I often wonder, you know, so much capacity goes into this general surveillance. Mass surveillance, and what would it look like if we put more of that capacity into actual targeted surveillance and training of police and doing more targeted police work in this area?
But isn't there a case that sometimes you don't know what you're looking for until you find it?
Well-
And by gathering a lot of information, you said there's some sort of almost serendipity about it, that you find it.
Well, you can't actually kind of like, I don't mean to suggest you are, waft away rights of privity to serendipity of gathering bulk data.
Absolutely.
There's got to be a balance here. And the other thing I'd say to that is this: there are a lot of other ways that the security services can actually be focused on a person of interest, and bulk data ain't one of them.
Yeah.
We've got 3 or 4 questions. Oh my goodness,
Well,
4 more questions. We'll try
Was
and
it
do
something
all.
I said?
Shall we go from the front to the back in this section, please? We'll try and get through as many as we can. We've probably got about 20 minutes.
You going that way?
I don't mind. Yes, right. Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Well, I mean, because we're moving.
Yeah. Let's just ask the question, please.
Sorry, Richard Harkinson. I work for London Mining Network, so that I should say we welcome the hosting of this really informed debate. It can stay in the level of imminence unless we think it's informed by the question of e-commerce, e-business, the question of product, what is product, where it's produced, what it is. I mean, we know from the companies their value is based on their brand names, but there's products. So we would get some, to be surveilled, perhaps we would get some societal gain if we had goods, social goods produced from taxation. The other part of it would be the European and the critical resources policy, the 3 legs of that, and the development of going forward, the development of necessary resources produce the goods that we use, on which we do e-correspondence, e-communication. So I'd welcome the hosting here to take that forward to, with regard to conflict minerals, the work of Judith Sargentini, one of Jean's colleagues, a wider discussion about critical minerals within this. My question to you, as a citizen, is do you think that the investigations of dark money within Brexit, within that and the election, will be better investigated by the Information Commissioner than by the Electoral Commission in this country? And that probably
I tend to try and prepare for these things, I've got to say.
Caught it out.
I didn't prepare for that one. Shall I?
Yeah, have a stab at it.
Shall I have a stab at it?
Yeah.
Have a stab at it, though. I mean, I'll be honest with you, I can't answer the particularity of the latter part of your question, but I do say this, that investigations into alleged dark money is very important, and it's a big issue at the moment. And when one worries about what's going on online and on the internet, just throw this one, the Bitcoin developments are a big concern as far as online activity is concerned. And I do know it's been recently announced that the government have suggested that laws are going to be put in place to control Bitcoin transactions in much the way, for instance, proceeds of crime and other fraudulent legislation has been introduced to control and regulate, if you will, more conventional ways of payment. And I'm afraid I don't really know the specific answer to that to your latter question. It may well be someone else does. I don't know.
To you, Stephen? Information Commissioner's Office, not the Electoral Commission?
I think both of those organisations could add something. So election law is subtle and complex. I was an election observer a few years ago, so I had a tiny little corner of that view. But I think because a lot of the dark money, whatever that means, was spent on advertising, I think people who actually understand how advertisers work and the advertising ecosystem work is very helpful. And there aren't that many people to understand that, and probably quite a few of them are in the Information Commissioner's Office or their counterparts elsewhere in Europe. So I can see a useful thing.
I should just say that on Facebook Live, hello, if you have a question and we can feed it in, please send us a question and we'll try and feed it in if one of the staff can help us.
Subsequently, how do we advocate for that then? If that's a good idea.
Well, actually, I've heard this is happening not so much in the UK, but in the US. So actually, US citizens who are living in the UK, they're allowed to vote, are using EU law to find out about how their data was used to influence targeting of advertising.
Okay.
Hi there. My name's Simon Jones. I run the Onti project, and Onti is a new protected identity social network, so it might appeal to most of the audience here today. What I wanted to ask you about is going back to GDPR for a second, and the important concept of consent for data collection within So my understanding of GDPR is that it's trying to get away from the world that we've lived in today, where you sign over forever your rights for data collection, irrespective of their future exploitation of that data. But the problem is that when data is collected, the people doing it at the time, they can never forecast what in 10 or 20 years' time, what the organisations that then have that data are then going to exploit it. And I'm wondering whether you think the GDPR is going to go far enough to prevent that. Because you were talking about transaction data a lot, and the Tesco Club card is a brilliant example. Because the comparison I always make is if I want to make a financial investment, I always get a very, very clear warning that the future value of my investment may go up or may go down. But if I sign up to a Tesco Club card, at no stage does anyone ever tell me, if you take this on, this may affect the future value of your car insurance premium. And with the Tesco Club card, it certainly does affect your insurance quotations. So why are those very simple warnings, which are actually very understandable to the most modest of citizens out there, if there are simple warnings of simple consequences of exploitation of data collection, then consumers will make very, very different decisions.
Yes,
and should those things be enforced?
I agree with it.
So,
who wants to go first?
Apart from the aspect, which is part of the e-privacy directive, of the selling your data to third parties, like I think I mentioned before, that telecommunications operators, that you have to have specific consent before your SMS data, whatever, is passed on to a third party, and making that applicable to social networks is part of that directive. But if I understood you correctly, it's calling for expiration date for data, right? Like a sell-by date to when you're
future-proofing.
Enforcing very simple consequences being explained to people. Like, if you do this, your car insurance premium quotation will be affected by this data. People will think, I'm not giving Tesco my shopping data. It's a very, very simple switch. And I'm not sure GDPR is going to enforce those kinds of things.
I think there's still a lot of room to go, and I think this idea of like not being, even if you do consent to sell your data off to a third party, that needs to be under review of frameworks or circumstances change, and this sort of expiry date for data is something that definitely should be considered. But I think it's also an important point that you raise: how do we advocate for this kind of thing? How do we create awareness for these kind of issues? And very often, from like a campaigning or activist side, it's not that easy to come up with very good examples that really hit people and think like, wow, yeah, of course I don't want that, and then get them out there. And I think that's a good point.
Just one more tiny thing. So I also think not engaging in, say, the club card system in this particular example is not necessarily to your long-term benefit. I expect you'll actually end up losing out and paying more for your insurance. The people that have that.
It's part of the pre-step to the Chinese credit score
between
system.
a rock and a hard place.
Yeah.
I agree with that.
Yes. Thank you very much for the debate. I'm Giovanni Battista Gallus from the Nexus Center of Internet Society of the Polytechnic of Turin and former LLM graduate at UCL. I was thinking about a point that has been making several times, that data protection is based on personal data. So, but there are several examples now of aggregated data and the use of aggregated data, which still can be used for discrimination, still can be used for shaping decisions with regards to individual. So is it maybe a problem of the future, and how would you tackle it? Not only with regard to personal data, but with aggregated data, which could be also anonymous, but still can of course, shape the future of persons.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point. We have been focusing, and rightly so, on the collection of individual data, but it goes also back to a question I think one of your colleagues asked earlier on about how it influences purchases, how it influences buying patterns and that sort of thing. I mean, realistically, one can't, if data is obtained, one can't stop corporate enterprises interpreting that data. And the problem goes further. Data could be obtained, aggregated data could be obtained and be used, for instance, by pressure groups, and therefore influenced politically. And so in that respect, I'm not for regulation. One can over-regulate. But what one could do in the situation that you've described is, particularly when it comes into the political use of aggregated data to try and influence passing of acts of parliament, passing of laws, then indeed Parliament and indeed those that legislate on our behalf should be far more aware of the way aggregated data can misrepresent a situation. And so again, it comes back to the mantra of understanding education. I don't mean education in a patrician sense, where you sit people down and shout at them, but
you're describing my career.
Well, I'm describing my early years at school as well. Let me be clear what I mean by education in the general sense. It's just a matter of making information available to people so that they can understand the ramifications of what's happening, and also making it clear to our lawmakers, our politicians, our legislators, not necessarily to accept aggregated data as being a reason necessarily to make a law. That's the way forward. It's not particularly a sexy way forward, like regulation or laws, but I think it's the most realistic way forward.
Can I just ask how many more questions we've got? Because I know there were a lot.
We've got one.
Okay, let's take that in a second. So just put your hands up again, sorry. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 with the lady there. I'm not going to come back to you two, I'm really sorry. So we've got 7, 8, plus the 9. We've got to be quick. I want to try and...
But why did you look at me when you said that?
No, I didn't mean you. Would I? Would I? Yes. It's great to have so many questions. I just want to make sure we get through them all. Thank you.
Hi, my name's Claire Jarvis. I'm an independent legal researcher. I just wanted to make 2 points about the way the European Court of Human Rights approaches interferences with the right to private life. When it's looking at cases involving surveillance, either monitoring in the workplace or CCTV outside it, when it's deciding whether or not the right is engaged in the first place, it asks whether or not people have a reasonable expectation of privacy. And what that means is, in effect, if you're warned about the monitoring or the surveillance, then your expectations are reduced and might, in fact, be extinguished altogether. And the problem is that that obviously gives corporates and governments a get-out if they warn us. And you get into the circular position that the more intrusive the technology, the lower the expectation of privacy. So you may not even clear the threshold for the right to private life in the first place. And then the second problem is that if you do clear that threshold, when the court looks at the proportionality test, it conceives the right to private life in a very atomistic way. So you effectively get the court trying to balance the individual's right to private life against wider societal interests in crime prevention, national security, and it fails to take into account that privacy has a societal value. It encourages dissent, it encourages creativity, all of which are necessary for a flourishing society. So I just wanted to make those observations.
I think the latter observation is very, very important indeed, if I may say so, and that's where we focus, again, understandably, on issues of privacy and the battle between privacy and security and law enforcement. But it's privacy is important of its own right and needs to be constantly reasserted that it is an important right, an important human right, and that's what we're discussing here in its own right, and should be valued for the very reasons you concluded.
Shall we take the Facebook Live question?
Sure, shall I just read it out?
Yes, please.
Okay, so Veronica on Facebook asks, can the EU do something if an EU member, and she cites Spain as the example, applies a law that allows the government to control content published on social media, or even imprison those or accuse them of lying?
Can the EU do anything?
Well, it can only do it if within the confines of the law that we have, and where the the point about interpretation at the national level comes. I mean, I think that some of this, if it's on social media, a lot of, if it's threat to life or whatever, will be covered by national law anyway. If it's dissent in terms of, I don't know, I support the Catalan independence, then that, one would argue, is a political freedom. And this, if you're looking at those sort of freedoms, I think you're looking much more with the European Court of Human Rights at Strasbourg, rather than you necessarily are at the moment with European Union law. I mean, others may disagree, but that, in which case, tell me. But, that would seem to me, at the moment, where we're at. If you think that eventually this all adds up to state oppression, then we start looking at the European Treaty in terms of whether member states are actually complying with their human rights obligations. And that's what we're looking at the moment, of course, with Poland and Hungary.
Here.
Thank you. My name's Charlotte Justice. I'm a human resources consultant. But just changing tack slightly, or very much so, are there any provisions in place for our personal data when we die?
There are provisions in place as far as protection of that personal data is concerned, but only if, for instance, it's initiated, I would suggest, by the way, I could say, I'm not giving legal advice. I've got to put that rider out here for my own.
The points you might wish to consider.
You actually smile, but I'm making that very clear
but
indeed.
You do have a stall in reception.
No, I'm not giving legal advice here, and nothing I say here to anyone on any specific issue should be taken as giving legal advice.
John, you should have said that at the beginning.
And those lawyers in the room will know exactly why I'm saying that. There's some horrifying cases out there. But as far as I understand it, and others may have a more better handle on this, it has to be asserted, and if it's not asserted, no.
By who?
By those that may survive or have an interest in it.
It's an issue on Facebook, huge issue, and there's a crazy statistic how many profiles on Facebook belong to people who've deceased in the meantime, and therefore they had to put a new...
You have to kind of, if you have someone who's passed, you have to present the death certificates to Facebook, and they would take the data down. But there doesn't seem to be anything to stop Facebook or the bank or anyone else passing that data on, that person just died, to estate agents.
Well, one thing's for sure, if people do nothing and the surviving relatives do not do what you just said, that will happen. So that's why I'm saying when I said people need to assert it. But if anyone's ever concerned about any particular issues, I advise them to go and see a lawyer.
Right. Of course. Where have we got to? Right. If we're carrying on with the tidal wave, the Mexican wave of questions, it was here and then the back, here. Thank you. We'll try and get through all of them.
Thank you very much. My name is Daniel Al. I'm a law student at LSE. My question talks about, there was a lot of debate about the lack of merit of mass surveillance and bulk data collection. And given the fact that all security services in the world are by definition secret and operate by the principles of neither confirm nor deny, and even the Investigative Powers Tribunal, the only tribunal that exists to protect individuals' rights and the abuse of security services, will not inform you of a decision made about them if they cannot do so. How do we evaluate the lack of merit of bulk surveillance when we have no data and no evidence to critique it at all?
Yeah, that's an important question. It's actually one of the things that I'm researching at the moment, which is how do you provide some accountability while still protecting necessary restrictions. It's not the case that nothing is public about what goes on. There's been court cases in Europe where actually quite a lot of information has been disclosed, much to the unhappiness of certain intelligence agencies. There's also the question about whether it should be disclosed to the individual that they've been surveilled at the end of the operations. That's also debatably going to happen to some extent. But at the very least that we can somehow get aggregate statistics on the sorts of privacy invasions that are going on. So it turns out it's quite counterintuitive, but there are ways to provably provide aggregate statistics about surveillance without actually disclosing any individual operations. So maybe if we can build the technology, then perhaps that will eventually move into law.
I'm going to be really quick if I can. Yes.
Hi, thank you. I'm Beatriz, I'm a journalist, and I developed a digital platform to tackle and deconstruct extremist messages. So my question is regarding hate speech. So what do you think is the borderline between freedom of speech and the use of the internet to spread hate messages?
Okay. It's a very important question. It goes to the very heart of the use of the social media. I've interfaced with it both in my cases represented the occupiers outside St Paul's Cathedral and a number of other cases I've dealt with involving the interface of freedom of speech and what you should say. First thing to say is this, that freedom of speech, Article 10, is one of the most vital rights we have. Maybe even more important than privacy, but it isn't a competition. But it is probably the most vital right next to the right to life that we have. It's also a very uncomfortable right to live with. It's like having a great friend who annoys you and upsets you and sometimes makes you downright angry every other week, but they're nonetheless a good friend and you carry on living around them and with them. That's freedom of speech. And freedom of speech is the right to be obnoxious, it's the right to be unpleasant, it's the right to be all those things. But there has to be a line somewhere in freedom of speech, and the big issue is, and it touches on your question, where is that line drawn? But it shouldn't be drawn too low. That's the first thing I'll say. That's the danger. It's as much a danger to draw it too low than too high. But what I do say is when it comes to hate speech, race involving race, culture, sexual inclination, whatever you will, then that's criminal. Then that's illegal. And there are acts of parliament in existence, such malicious Communications Act, Anti-Harassment Act, Public Order Act, a number of acts which will bite to that. But it is, I've concluded, I know you're anxious to... Yeah, I know, but I cannot, particularly as it's going live streaming, deal with this question in a sort of shorthand way, because it's a vital question and it cannot be misinterpreted. Freedom of speech is the freedom to be obnoxious and unpleasant, but it's not freedom to be racially abusive, sexually abusive, and the law has ways of dealing with it.
Hi, my name is Sana, and I'm a student at King's. When it comes to data protection, a lot has been said about educating individuals so they can opt out of these services. But what if individuals are dependent on these services? So say, in order for them to access the internet and Wi-Fi, they have to submit data, or they depend on doing services and as an extra source of income. So while it's very idealistic to say, let's educate people so they can opt out of them, what if people cannot opt out of them?
Probably David and me as well, isn't it?
Yes.
I've been called idealistic for many, many years. I take it as a compliment, actually. I take it as a compliment. I understand, and I think it's a point one of my colleagues made a little earlier on when I was talking about giving your data away for club cards and that sort of thing. I do understand that, absolutely. I mean, it's happened to me as well. For instance, the latest thing, was it Google or Facebook that said I couldn't get any more access? Google, I think it was, unless I signed up again to their privacy terms. And I held out for about 3 weeks and felt very good about it. You know, but then I became totally misinformed, completely cut off, and completely isolated. And so, even I, with all that I believe about privacy, backed down and signed up. Yeah. It is, in many respects, that sort of pressure which we cannot do anything about. I have to say, one just has to take it as far as one can within their own personal circumstances.
But this is also where the law, in terms of framing, what has to be included in terms and conditions, I think also has a role to play.
I would say this, and very briefly, because I know the dreaded hand is out there. I would say this very quickly, because I've been meaning to say this for a while. I really do think that government should get to grips with club cards. And give guidance and directive to, it's not just Tesco, it's a lot of other people as well, as to what they can do and what information the public should be given. And I really do think government should grapple with this.
Thank you for being patient.
Right, thank you very much for the opportunity to ask a question. It's been a fascinating debate. My name's Tony. I run a social enterprise called the Great Debaters Club. My question is in response to something that John said. I'd be particularly keen to hear what Jean has to say about it as the resident lawmaker in the room. And the question is about the proportionality argument you raised about balancing liberty and security. A similar argument I'd expect to hear from somebody on the other side of the fence from you, arguing for things like encryption, which is the example I want to come to. Defending breaking encryption in order to maximise security, prevent terrorist attacks. The exact question is this. The best analogy I've heard to use to describe encryption is giving the police or security services a key to everyone's door in order to be able to search one person's door. And that's why it's a problem. But what if proportionality wasn't an option? What if the only way to search one single door, one single house, was to give them the key to everyone's house? What would you do if proportionality isn't an option?
Is that for me? Or
That's a Jean.
Yeah.
For me, I come back to the human rights framework, you know, and that I would also argue that the key to the house is not the only option that you have. People have to go outside sometimes, you know, so therefore you look at what are the other options, what else do you work with, and they're also on encryption. We're also being told that we need to be much more aware about our financial security online, you know, online fraud, etc. is a really big business. Encryption is essential within all of that. So, you know, you're also telling us that on the one hand we have to be very careful with our information, our financial information, all the rest of it, to prevent crime. On the other hand, you know, we're also being told you have to be prepared to open up to prevent crime. I will go, thank you, with keeping the doors locked, because that way at least we're all inside together.
Particularly if you don't trust the people with the key.
I know that lunch is ready, so I'm just don't want to keep you too long, but I do want to make sure with 5 minutes.
Have you all given your dietary requirements and breached your privacy? That's a breach of privacy as well.
Who's next, please?
Just joking.
Thank you.
Just like to hear the policy recommendations, particularly from the two nearest members of the panel to me at this end.
Policy
Not so
recommendations.
much policy recommendations, yes.
I mean, from my side, I have to say, as I said in the beginning, I think the e-privacy directive is one of the few pieces of proposed legislation that really creates a lot of hope amongst activists. So I would just repeat myself with a number of things that I've said before. I think privacy by design and privacy by default are two key aspects. Increasing and maintaining the right to encryption is another key aspect. Creating boundaries for the ability and right of organizations to track people on and offline, and enforcing a do not track principle be another aspect. I think those are all key regulatory issues that need to be implemented.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add is that the details really do matter, and particularly the technical details. The so-called cookie law basically didn't do anything good, because it didn't deal with the implementation didn't deal with the right technical aspects of it. When it comes to the e-privacy directive, and also comes to the GDPR, making sure that there's a good diversity of people with the right technical expertise to actually show what is possible, because sometimes what is possible is actually quite counterintuitive when you just approach it from what people deal with in their normal lives.
And accountability as well, I'd throw into them.
Our finale.
We have to remind ourselves who we are and what defines us. It's just the values. One of those is freedom, but freedom is not unrestricted. Neither is sovereignty. Just to remind, in the context of Brexit, as we go through the ages, with the value of freedom and the constriction on freedom and sovereignty has changed, and it will change dramatically because of existential risks that exist right now, over 10 key existential risks. The consequences of this is that in terms of privacy, because that's the subject of today's debate, we have to take into account the impact of technology. On the positive side, it will be much easier to control privacy if we have quantum encryption, because today's encryption can be gone through the window in just 3 years' time. And finally, when we arrive in, say, 30, 40 years' time, we will be able to read each other's mind easily. So privacy will be gone, unfortunately.
That's really depressing. I knew there was a reason I'd started there and finished there. Does anyone wish to respond?
Well, it's on quantum encryption and the quantum computation is going to be very interesting. One of the aspects of it is that quantum encryption has a much greater tendency to encourage centralized approaches. It's not the case that you can do quantum encryption from your phone to someone else's phone. It has to go through any intermediaries. And these intermediaries can read your messages. So it gives better security from some perspectives, but lesser security from other perspectives. And I think it's interesting, I won't go any more detailed than that, to say that China is at the forefront of developing a quantum encrypted internet.
Thank you. We've reached the end of today's event, but we can continue the conversations over lunch. I'm told by Makis that there's a little something for you to take away, if you'd like, because the 2018 European Parliament diaries are available to you, free, in reception. Please help yourself. On behalf of the European Parliament UK Information Office and the UCL European Institute, I would like to thank all of our panellists for giving up their time today and for such an insightful discussion. If you've joined us on Facebook Live, thank you for doing that. And to all of you for attending and some fantastic questions, thank you very much.